so much for being willing to have me interview you about the development of IFS. Is there something we want to say before I start asking questions?
No, just I appreciate you're willing to do this, and because we had our 30th anniversary recently, I put a lot of thought into some of the history, so it's fun for me to go back over it.
Great. So I'm curious about the early influences in your life that started you on the path that led to IFS. So how about starting with your family?
Yeah, well, as I thought about 30 years and what led up to my running into this, I felt like there were certain elements that had to be in place before I encountered the phenomena for this to happen. So one of them was I had to have the father that I had, and for a couple of reasons. One is he's a prominent medical researcher and also head of medicine at this big medical complex in Chicago. And I'm the oldest of 6 boys, and was supposed to be a physician, obviously, and didn't have a head for science at all. Didn't really have a head for school, actually. And so he was really hard on me about that. And so he produced a kind of pool of worthlessness that actually I needed to drive some of this. And so in other parts were formed to deal with the worthlessness, one of which was a part that's kind of grandiose and feels like I'm here to do something really important and I'm so great and that kind of thing. And a part that really didn't care what people thought. And then also a part that really felt like, well, his big thing was you have to justify your existence. And that drove him, this idea that he had to produce something for humanity to prove that he was worth being here. And his parents, there's Holocaust stuff, and there's a lot of stuff, reasons for that. But that I took in a big way too. So all of those combined made me gave me a kind of drive to prove that I was valuable and to also do it through some kind of humanitarian thing. And then on the other side of it, because we talk about burdens you get from your family, but also family heirlooms or treasures. And so he had an amazing kind of ethical integrity and concern for patients and courage to stand up to drug companies, and so he modeled a lot of those qualities that have served me too. And then my mother comes from this pioneering, her mother homesteaded by herself in Montana, and
Was your mom Jewish?
no.
Oh, I was going to say, it didn't sound like a Jewish story.
No. But she did convert to marry my father, which also was courageous relative to her family. So there, I've got some qualities from her side too.
Do you think of the Tikkun Olam ethic in Judaism? Do you think that that's part of the whole?
Yeah, I think that I think that was some of my father's stuff. For
so
sure.
the repair the world for people who aren't aware of that.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let me just see if I forgot anything. And 3 of my brothers are physicians, all of them researchers to one degree or another, and one of them is going to publish an article in Science that's going to revolutionize the thinking about diabetes. So they all got a big dose of it. So otherwise, then I got out of the family that way, and was pretty shy and kind of insecure, and went to college at this small liberal arts school in Illinois called Knox College, and decided, or at least somebody bet me about trying out for the football team there, because I hadn't played football in high school, but I was really fast. I was a track runner. And so I tried out, and again, at my size, I think I said yesterday, probably the smallest starter in the country. Never thought I would make it, but I did. And I also kind of became a star. And that was a big confidence boost. And also, to survive in that arena, I had to surrender, basically. Because if somebody's running at you, and they're almost twice your size, and they're as fast as you, and you have to run and knock them down, you have to get all these scared parts to get out of the way. So I got to the point where I could really just
push
myself and not care, or at least not think of the consequences, just really surrender to whatever's going to happen.
So are you saying that helped your development of a new model? Without worrying
I think it
about,
helped,
yeah.
I think it helped with the not worrying about the consequences, just really following.
Like having some radical ideas and not
Yeah.
worrying about what people thought. And, yeah.
And those were the 60s, and I got a big dose of anti-establishment stuff, and also Save the World stuff, another hit of that during those days, and also through some drug experiences, like hallucinogen experiences, and then later after that got into meditating and did TM for about 8 years. Came to realize there was more to reality than the reality that we live in. And I think that sensitized me a bit to the idea of self when I ultimately ran into it. So those were really fertile years, the 60s, for the kind of preparation for this.
Great. So then you got a doctorate in family therapy, is that right?
Yeah, well what happened is, before that, when I was still in college, my father got me a job on the psych unit at the hospital, Rush Presbyterian St. Luke's. And I was an occupational therapy aide, which meant I would go bowling and swimming with the patients. And a lot of these, this was an adolescent unit, so a lot of these kids were just a few years younger than me, and I got very close to them. And it was a very psychoanalytic unit. So the psychiatrists would take these kids in their office and explore whatever they explored, and the kids would tell me about their sessions, which often sounded absurd to me. And like if a kid didn't talk, they'd spend the whole session in silence, for example. And at the same time that I was working weekends, and I'd be on the day room when the families would come to visit, and I would see the families just tearing into these kids for what they were doing to them. And I was really close to one girl in particular, and I saw that happen with her family, and she the next day killed herself. And I thought, this is absurd. This is kind of an insane way to do therapy. There's got to be some other way to do this.
Did you have the idea in that moment that why didn't people help that girl with her family and her family with her?
Yeah,
You did?
I was thinking that. And this was well before family therapy.
Right.
I didn't know anything about family therapy, but I thought, look at what they're doing to this kid. And the therapy is just about her and how bad, how sick she is.
Yeah.
So I had that sort of seed planted there. And then so I started to look around for, I thought, well, maybe this is something I can do. Maybe I can do something in this realm. And I started to look around for thinking that might fit, and ran into Gregory Bateson's work. And he was saying, for people and animals, you can't understand their behavior until you understand the larger context in which the behavior is taking place. And so that was very exciting to me. And I started to research where his thinking had gotten into psychotherapy, and it turned out to be these pioneers of family therapy were into that. So
what year was that when you went into graduate school?
I did a master's in community mental health because at first I thought, well, let's change the whole community. And found out, first of all, it's really hard to do that. And I was too shy to be any good at it. I wasn't any good at community organizing. And but at that program, that was 74, I think, there was a family therapist in another department. And I started to apprentice with him. Me and a guy named Howie Little, I don't know if you know that name, but we were both little punks back then. And Howie turned me on then to structural family therapy, which got me really excited, because there were these clear ways to see these problems in families that you could actually point to and say, this is what you need to do differently.
Well, I see a lot of structure. I see a foundation of structural family therapy in a way with IFS, because it's like how the parts are connected.
It's
And
basically what I
Yeah,
did. I
exactly.
brought structural family therapy to this internal system
Yeah.
in terms of my understanding of it at first. And, you know, I actually, in preparation for this, I went over all the family therapy influences.
In preparation for this?
Yeah.
Oh, cool.
And then how they played out in my
Mhm.
thinking about
Mhm.
inner systems, and then all the stuff that I had to discard because it didn't fit. So
Right.
we can talk about that whenever you want.
Right. Well, one of the early ideas of structural family therapy that I'm thinking about now was that we had to make a system change because they were so stuck.
Right.
You know, the sort of homeostasis versus
Homeostasis,
morphogenesis, which now even the more modern day structural therapists are more gentle and realize that you can just use the people's own angst that's already pre-existing.
Right.
But that seems to be a big departure in terms of IFS.
Yeah, that was one that I had to give up, the
Mhm.
idea that families will resist, and so you have to have a big club to kind of beat them into submission.
Right.
And, or else, you know, it was structural strategic
Mm-hmm.
back in the day, so you either had to trick them into changing
Right.
with some kind of
Reverse
paradox.
psychology, right?
Yeah. Or you had to point out all of their flaws
Mhm.
and how they needed to change.
Right.
So yeah, I had to totally jettison that approach when I got into the internal system.
Any
That's
ideas
right.
that are enduring for you in terms of that from strategic?
Well, yeah, from strategic, the idea of vicious circles and sequences that escalate over time, and how just intervening at one point in the sequence will kind of ripple is a very useful idea with the internal systems also, in terms of looking at polarizations between parts and how more of the same, the more a part does one thing, the more another part will escalate in the opposite direction.
Right.
So all of that I still hold on to.
Yeah, great. Yeah, when I watch you work, I see a lot of family therapy moves, even with the individual. So in the early influences, mentors, are there more you want to say about, Bateson, Satir, Bowen?
Yeah, well, I wound up, I was really immersed in structural
Oh,
and
you said
strategic
that,
from
right.
Howie. And then I decided to get a doctorate in family therapy and went to Purdue. And my mentor there was a guy named Doug Sprinkle, who's,
Oh, wow.
you know Doug?
Common factors?
Yeah, yeah. So, and he introduced me more to Virginia Satir's stuff and Murray Bowen, and they also had an influence when I took a look at internal systems too, which again I can go over all that, but those were the primary influences, both structural, strategic, and then some Bowen and then some Satir.
So I think this might be an okay time to talk more about the family therapy influences. What would you say about how Satir and Bowen influenced your work?
Well, let me just, when I first encountered inner systems, I had this idea from family therapy that anytime a system gets distressed, some member of the system will find a way to try and help it out by distracting. And so in families, the symptom bearer was sort of an elected office, that that a kid would sacrifice themselves to help the family by giving a focus. And so as I would look at these internal systems and I saw these extreme behaviors, that question, which I actually was asking families, like in a kind of obnoxious way, I would say to a family, what would it be like for you if your kid didn't have this problem? And, they'd be very defensive, obviously, about that. But when I got to internal systems, I could ask these extreme parts, what are you afraid would happen if you didn't do this thing? And it was sort of the same idea, that the part was serving some function for the larger system. Does that make sense?
Totally.
Yeah. So I came with that. The whole idea of boundaries from structural family
Right.
therapy, and boundaries and
Roles, hierarchies.
yeah, boundaries and hierarchy. So boundaries, translated in family work, it's people are too enmeshed, they're too caught up with each other, or they're too distant, they're too disengaged.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw that in internal systems. There were parts that were very blended with the self and had too much power and too much responsibility. And then there were parts that were exiled, they were disconnected in the same kind of way. So again, these are all things that I was trying to assess as I was going inside. And then the idea of hierarchy and how important it was, and how when I was working with families, if you just shored up the parenting a little bit, a lot of the symptoms would abate too. Just by improving the leadership in the system,
Right.
everybody calms down. And so as I ran into the self thing, I got all excited because, that's what we could do. So
Allowing self to parent the
allowing,
parts.
just to improve the parenting of this internal system by releasing this parent
Mm-hmm.
who knew just how to do it, but who'd been overwhelmed by the parentified kids. So again, the family therapy idea.
And maybe parts that are stuck at a certain age of development.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Same-
kind of
same
bringing
thing.
them up to speed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or if they want to, or just letting them be kids rather than
Right.
having to run the system.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So all that was a direct translation from a family system. And the ideas about polarization and how, and cross-generational alliances, so some parts would be allied with others, against others, and all of that was just very evident. It's all parallel.
Mm-hmm.
As we said before, the attempted solutions creating more of the same kinds of escalations.
Right.
Again, you see that all over the inner systems too.
Yeah.
So I was very interested in tracking sequences between parts in the same way we did with family members.
Do you see a connection between Bowen and some of the ideas about legacy and intergenerational trauma?
Exactly, yeah. So Bowen pioneered that
Mm-hmm.
intergenerational transmission of emotion and enmeshment and so on. And so that also sensitized me to the idea of legacy burdens. Right.
I also think of Bowen, you may differ about this, as like the first mindfulness and psychotherapy person in terms of his idea about non-reactivity.
Uh-huh.
And it seems like there's a lot in the way that IFS works that kind of decreases the reactivity
Uh-huh.
so that people can actually do the work.
Yeah, so I hadn't thought of Bowen that way. That's interesting.
Yeah. I hadn't thought of Bowen that way either until I was teaching it for a number of years and really read that.
Huh.
Such a focus on non-reactivity and sort of being able to calm down and reflect
Right.
from a reflective distance as opposed to just acting out
Which
stuff
was sort
in
of
the sessions.
his definition of differentiation.
Exactly.
A differentiated person.
Right.
So that idea of differentiation,
Mm-hmm.
I saw the direct parallel to self leadership, although his was a more intellectual kind of
Right.
differentiation than self.
Yeah, and his idea, I think it's non-reactivity in order to have the cognition take over. And
Yeah.
Whereas yours is more of a emotionally connected, embodied
Nurturing,
practice.
yes,
Right.
that's right. Yeah. Another idea from family therapy that we were taught to join with the parents first, or the gatekeepers of the system, before you get into the stuff with the kids, or before you open up these secrets and talk about them. And again, a direct parallel to
Oh, that makes so much sense.
to working with
Yeah.
protectors first
Right.
and respecting them and getting their permission to go.
Work with the ones that are in charge. Yeah.
And then the idea that this was just a kind of general, I guess mainly from Satir and structural, the idea that people are a lot less pathological at their core than other models of psychotherapy had believed.
Yeah, That's definitely a thread through all the fields of family therapy,
Yeah,
I think.
I think it is.
And that's one thing that I find is so refreshing in terms of this model.
Mhm. Yeah, the idea that people are constrained from using their resources, but the resources are there.
Right.
It was pretty universal, like you said.
And welcoming
Mhm.
all parts and understanding they have good intentions.
Yeah.
Which good intentions...
They're functioning, playing a role in the system.
Right.
Yeah.
Solution-oriented really builds on that idea of intention, what's
Yeah.
people's intention.
Yeah, I mean, from my point of view, they're naive in how that's all you need to do, but...
Right.
And then Satir had the belief that poor communication was the result of poor self-esteem. And that sensitized me also to the worthlessness that exiles would carry, that then would drive the way people would behave, and how important it was to get to that self-esteem issue.
Mm.
So all those, I think, I needed all of that to make sense of the inner world when I got there. But as you say, there were a bunch of things from family therapy I had to jettison.
Yeah, I'm curious about that.
So, one of those would be, like we were talking about, the therapist is the expert.
Right.
And needs to tell everybody how to shape up and
Mhm.
change, or trick them into it. And I got into inner systems, they would have none of that. So they would just get stronger and fight harder, as I said yesterday. That the past is irrelevant to change, which was a big part of structural family therapy, that you could reorganize the system in the present and you didn't have to worry about the past. And that's all you needed to keep your eyes on. And also that trauma wasn't a big deal either, that people had all these, so it was overly optimistic in the sense that people had all these resources, and again, all you needed to just change the external system and all that would be available to them.
And not really unpack the trauma.
You don't need to worry about trauma. That people are that resilient, in other words. And that transference and countertransference is a kind of nice psychoanalytic concept, but isn't that relevant either. And the therapist relationship isn't that relevant. All of those things I had to jettison. And that emotions aren't that important either. So all that is totally different. The therapy should be very brief. And if you can't fix somebody in 15 sessions, you're a loser. The families are very, very resistant and want to maintain homeostasis. That you have to stay focused on the problem. And departures from that are a waste of time, or you're wasting the family's time. And the extreme thoughts and emotions, most family therapy just didn't have a thinking about them, but that they're internalizations, or that there's some kind of an out-of-control impulse that I had to totally reverse my thinking about when I got inside.
So a lot of the family therapy schools have let go a lot of those ideas, and I'm curious about where, in terms of the newer schools of family therapy, you and I were talking about how there's certain ideas, say with narrative and solution-oriented, that you find useful, and then how IFS departs from that.
In the early days, Michael White and I had an ongoing conversation for many years, and there were many things about narrative I liked. I liked the socio-political elements of it, the liberation theology almost of it. But then it came down to what he called externalization, or externalizing problems. And the idea of separating the person from the problem I liked, but then what he did with it got in the way, because he would always pit the person against the problem. And I was just having a conversation with somebody here about how that seems to have changed some. But I just couldn't go with that, and we would have these long debates about that.
So could you just name the concept in IFS that that would be different from that, just for people who don't totally get that yet?
Well, I mean, you could call focusing on a part a way of externalizing. focusing on a part that's causing a problem or is related to a problem as a way of externalizing it, which was the similarity.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I mean, as I recall, he would talk about sneaky poo and sneaky pee, and so a kid who has enuresis would see that as something to fight with. Or anorexia, he was doing a lot of that.
Mm-hmm.
So we do the opposite. We externalize the anorexic part, the part that's making you starve, but then we love it up. We appreciate it. We get its backstory to let it know how much we see it's trying to save our life. It's totally the opposite.
Right. So it's basically trying to understand those parts and the intentions they have and how they're working hard and
Yeah.
for the person, not against the person.
So it's true that they've changed on that. I'm really glad to hear it. It would be much more compatible if that's true.
Yeah.
But that was kind of the departure point.
Great. So it sounds like it might be good for us to talk about a little about the development of IFS more in terms of when you started developing the model.
Okay, so I came out of Purdue and got a job at this prestigious Institute for Juvenile Research in Chicago in their intensive family therapy training program with a couple colleagues at the time, Doug Brenner and Betty Carr. Maybe you know, I don't know if you know those guys.
I know who Doug is.
Yeah. And I think that was another thing that had to be in place for this to exist, because that was back in the day when the state would support these think tanks.
Yeah.
And you didn't have any required work, basically.
Yeah,
You would
exactly.
sit around and watch each other behind one-way mirrors and like that.
Like that, which has been laying fallow.
And every so often you do some training of
Right.
therapists, but mainly it was just playing with ideas and exploring. And
How fun was that?
that was amazing. And so I came as a family therapist, and I was as zealous as they were about how we were the cool systems thinkers, and we were so much cooler than those linear individual therapists who mucked around in intrapsychic stuff. And then a woman who was a student of mine and then became a colleague, Mary Jo Barrett, who's going to be here in a couple of weeks.
Next Saturday.
Or next Saturday, yeah. And has remained a good friend. Had a big interest in eating disorders and trauma, and I think it was the parts of me that wanted to prove to my father that what I was doing had some value. Was looking for a symptom that I could count, that you could actually say, this is really changing. And so bulimia appealed in that way, because we could measure how many binges and purges. So we connected with a local eating disorder group who referred us a bunch of patients and did an outcome study with about 30 bulimic kids and their families. And found that I, just wasn't getting the outcome that was promised by Mnuchin with anorexia.
Interesting.
And so then became very frustrated and broke that family therapy rule and started asking about what was happening inside of people. And then these clients started talking about their parts, and that was the big turning point for me. And I think another thing that was necessary was that I was totally ignorant about it. I hadn't studied, I assiduously avoided studying intrapsychic process and psychoanalysis. So I didn't have anything to put on what I was hearing. And I had to have that beginner's mind the Buddhists talk about. And so I carefully listened to what they were saying about their parts, rather than presuming they were introjects or whatever. And I think that was really important too. And then there were like epiphanies along the way. First, that parts aren't what they seem, that they actually are valuable, like kids in a family, and stuck in bad roles, and that everybody's got them, including myself. And so it's sort of the normal state of the mind to be this way. All of this was just revelatory to me. And then the big one was when I ran into self. and saw, even in people who had no business with that level of ego strain, if we got certain parts to open, the same self would show up with the same qualities.
So people that had been through horrible traumas.
Horrible traumas as
yeah.
children, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Horrible parents that I would search their histories to find some evidence of how they got this,
Mm-hmm.
and I couldn't. And so the point at which, and then I started trying this with other people, not just the bulimics, and finding it, they've got it too.
Mm-hmm.
So the point at which I started to think maybe it is in everybody, and maybe it doesn't take all that much to get to it.
Mm-hmm.
Then the whole big vision of the possibility came to me. And
So how would you define self and parts? Separately, self.
How would I define them?
Yeah, just in a short way for people to kind of, like a bumper sticker, what is the definition of self?
So, different from the common usage of the word self, which
right.
implies the whole person. This is a special state or place, for lack of a better word, inside people, but for me it's actually more spiritual than that. I could get into that, but it's, when I first ran into it, struggling to understand how this could be, given the histories and how it wasn't damaged, how it clearly wasn't damaged by all these horrible traumas, I started thinking, well, maybe evolution of the human species made it such that, like, if you cut your arm, your body immediately knows how to heal itself. Maybe this is our capacity for emotions, that we're born with this ability to know exactly how to heal ourselves emotionally, and that I had stumbled on a way to access that. And I held that view for quite a while, because I wasn't at all spiritual. I was very scientific, and my father was kind of an atheist, and I was still being very influenced by him. But then more and more spiritual experiences were happening to my clients, and I was getting more what you might call guidance about it, and so I've come to now see it as God in us, or where God has access, if you can pardon the expression, God. If you want to use some other word, that's fine, but that it's more than just our. It's more of a spiritual idea.
Well, there are a lot of religions that believe in the inside version of God and the top-down version.
Yeah.
So you're talking about the inside version of God.
I am, yeah. And that it isn't really separate from the other.
Not separate, exactly.
Yeah.
Right, they're just two different emanations.
Yeah, two different states
So that's
of
how
the
you're
same
thinking about it.
thing.
That's really lovely to hear.
Oh, thanks, yeah.
Yeah.
It's
And then, go ahead.
Sort of like a particle and a wave, that this
Right.
is the particle boundary state of it, and that the wave is more the oceanic state of it.
Yeah. And how would you define part?
Okay, well, this gets a little esoteric, and if
We're up for it.
Okay. So if I get too far into it, people's brains will explode, and
Okay. We'll stop you if we
bloody,
start having explosions in the room.
So for me, it's all nested systems. So if you were to work with a part, for example, I worked with multiple personality disorder or DID clients. I might work with one part for 10 sessions, just talking to it as a part. And it would start talking about its parts. And as I explored its system was a kind of microcosm or isomorph of the system in which it was embedded. And it had self, and it could work with its parts. And I've gone once I did one step lower and worked with a subpart, and it had parts.
It's kind of like the human
I
system.
told you, yeah, your brain's gonna explode.
Yeah. So it's like it goes back to the biological system, physics kind of metaphors.
Fractals.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
fractals, it's holograms, it's all of that stuff, which at some level only makes sense.
So that we're all just a bunch of parts, but we also have self.
Yeah, we're both.
Yeah.
And I've come to believe that we're here to connect the dots. That part of what we're here to do is connect to the parts in us, to the self in the parts of us, so to have self reconnect at all these different levels.
So they're all in relationship to each other,
Yeah.
in right relationship.
Right relations.
Yeah.
So healing and wholeness is about reconnection. It's about bringing everything back and
Is that the same as
integrated.
integration, or is that something different?
Well, it depends on
On
your,
how you
you
view
know,
it.
how you view it.
Mhm.
So integration, the way it would traditionally define, is the absence of parts. It's like they disappear.
Right.
Like you
Right.
return to a unitary mind, which from my point of view never
Right.
were.
So it's integrating the parts in relationship to one another.
So yeah, exactly. It's more
Yeah.
like
And accepting all of them.
integration and harmonization. It's more like if you've ever watched a flock of birds, how it seems like one entity.
Exactly.
But you could take a bird out of there and it would have autonomy.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So that's what we're shooting for. And yeah. So it's become more like that for me. But we don't impose any of that on people that study it. So there's a
Like
lot.
people can interpret it in their own way.
Yeah. There's
So
no
people who aren't so spiritual might think of it differently, and
totally
that's okay.
different, and that's fine.
Yeah. Great. I'm looking at the things that I was hoping we were covering, and there's only one other question that I have as a final one. Is there something else that you're thinking about?
Well, I just want to make sure I give credit to some of the people along the
right.
way, because it took a village to do this.
Definitely.
It took a village to figure this out, and also to get my parts out of the way. There were lots of people along the way that
People helped you with that.
busted my parts. So very early on, there was a woman named Reggie Goulding who co-authored Mosaic Mind with me, who wasn't a therapist, was just a friend who was a lawyer and got very interested, and in particular, she was a lawyer for sex abuse cases. So she got very interested in, and so Mosaic Mind is all about that. And one of my clients at the time was willing to talk to her, and so we recorded a lot of stuff from that. And she was a brilliant woman, Reggie, and really helped formulate a lot of this in the early days. And died suddenly of an aneurysm, so at a very young age. And then there was lots of resistance from my colleagues because I was betraying the family therapy cause at the time.
Have you been kicked out of AFTA?
I haven't, but they haven't asked me to do much, yeah. And so, yeah, those types gave me a really run for my money, because at the time I was fairly
Radical.
respected in the field.
Well, right, you were co-author.
I was
of
co-author of the big textbook.
Yeah, we still use that text,
Do
but
you?
your name
Okay.
has dropped off the book.
Oh, has? Oh, I didn't know that.
Have some of the people where you departed from when it seemed so radical what you were doing, have some of those people come to appreciate your model?
To varying degrees,
Yeah.
you know, nobody hates it anymore. That story that Cease talked about,
I'm trying to remember, remind me.
I sort of debuted with this, and I think it was like 1984, and I got up and talked to this group of family therapists that were in training with us, and also my colleagues. And I was talking about, well, I think, you know, I have a work part, and then I have a family part, and Doug kept saying, why do you have to call them parts? That's what my kids call their privates.
Change is hard.
So
I interrupted you because you were talking about the people that influenced you.
yeah, and then I was embedded in this very psychoanalytic department of psychiatry there. And I gave it grand rounds once, and a guy named Merton Gill was in the audience, who was a big name there, and just tore into me about how I'm implying that the relationship isn't that important, that people can actually heal themselves.
Oh, the relationship between the therapist
Between the
and
therapist
the
and the
client.
client. Which at the time I actually believed, which was one of those things I had to get correction on.
So you were kind of radical about that.
I was radical. my whole thing was partly from those experiences on the psych unit and seeing how these kids were so dependent on their therapists. I had this aversion to that kind of client dependent on therapists.
Right.
So when I stumbled onto this thing called self, I thought, oh great, you know.
I'm peripheral.
So yeah, I don't matter that much. It's really about the self. It can heal the person. And some of that is my own burdens of not wanting
Not
people...
wanting to take too much responsibility.
Yeah, not wanting to have people depend on me.
Right, right.
And so it took a while for people to say, no, your relationship is still very, very important.
Well, you know the common factors literature about the importance of the relationship.
Right.
I mean, it could be that, and that's maybe a little bit different than dependency.
Yeah.
It's about the quality of the relationship.
That's what I came to see, that if I can be in self,
Mm-hmm.
and I can convey this kind of energy, people still don't get dependent on me.
Right.
They just feel held. They feel,
They feel held.
safer. It helps
Right.
their protectors
Right.
relax
Right.
more and more and allows more self to come in. So my self becomes a kind of
Right.
tuning fork for
Right.
the self of the client.
I think one thing that isn't as obvious when you're not the client, when you're watching your work or when you're watching the videos, is how much self-energy is there.
Right.
Since I had the privilege of being your demo client, I really felt it. But when I watch, you know, you just don't feel that energetic connection in the same kind of way.
Right.
But I think it's really important.
It's really important. It is really
Yeah.
important. And over time I got to where I can very quickly get my parts to step back when I'm with a client. Not so much with my wife or my kids,
Right.
but when I'm with a client, I can really, and there's a literal vibrating energy that comes with that, that other systems call chi or ki or prana, which we just call self-energy.
Right.
And that energy is flowing in me, and I think clients feel it. So it's a very healing energy.
Yeah. So back to the other people that supported you.
Yeah, so Doug and Betty came around to the degree that they tolerated it. We co-authored this book together called Meta Frameworks, which was a way to try to address family therapy. Did you ever see that book?
No, I should read that.
It's actually a very good book. And so IFS was seen as one of 6 meta frameworks, others being sequences and culture and so on. So they became more supportive, but they didn't really join me in it. And it wasn't until I ran into somebody hooked me up with Ron Kurtz, who started Hakomi back in, I think, 92. I ran into him. And he's a systems thinker, he's not alive now. But he got all excited because they worked to some degree with parts, and so we collaborated for a number of years doing, he got me to come out and be with him at Esalen several times, and we had our differences, but I at the time was heady and intellectual and kind of academic, and he really opened up this whole world of other ways of expressive therapies that he was into, and being much more openly affectionate, and he probably pioneered in bringing mindfulness to psychotherapy, and also a big emphasis on a loving presence or a loving kindness from the therapist. So all of that was very influential to me, and how the body is important, and how finding parts in the body became an anchor. All of that I borrowed from Hakomi. And then the whole Hakomi community got interested, and a bunch of them became my first lead trainers. So, and then we continued to collaborate. Like Susan McConnell was totally in the Hakomi community, and Kay Gardner, and let me see, Karen Blachet, Barb Cargill, were all Hakomi people. And each of them put their stamp on the model in different ways. So the model at that point really started to blossom out and incorporated psychodrama and body kind of work and dance movement therapy. And there were just ways to adapt the framework, the conceptual framework, to all of these different formats. And Paul Ginter was really big into mindfulness, so he brought a lot of that. Let me just see what else. And Mike Elkin, who's local here, was into hypnotherapy and brought some sort of innovative technique. And, so that was a really kind of golden, flowering period in the 90s of just exploring with a group. You know, I finally had a group of people that were totally into this. Mitchie Rose was a big collaborator around the whole unburdening. She was into shamanism, so she could bring some of that perspective. So
interesting. So do you feel like you acknowledged who you want to acknowledge for the moment?
I think so, yeah.
Great. So my last question is, did you ever think that IFS was going to get so big? And my second, or my subset of that last question is, and do you feel like you've gotten to where you want to be?
So, you know, as I said, when I first saw the self was in everybody, and the potential of that hit me as something much, much bigger than it's gotten to be. So it's a kind of combination. It was one of those where I saw this huge potential, but then I thought, who's going to make this happen? Because I'm just a little kid, you know, who's going to listen to me? And there are parts of me that still feel that way, but I've been kind of waiting for the one to come along who could really take this where it's supposed to go. And it turns out I'm the one I've been waiting for.
And for those who don't know, he has a book with that title, You Are the One You've Been Waiting For.
Right.
On couple therapy.
Right.
And IFS.
So I've had to work with all my parts that think I'm a little kid or shy and so on, just to move this along. But, you know, in the last 4 or 5 years, some big grown-up people have come into the system and maybe can take it to places that I can't. So I'm very excited about that. But, you know, I feel really good about where things are and how far we've come. And I still have this big vision that I got 30 years ago of possibility and places I would like to take it. And that includes medicine and spirituality and business consulting. And I just think if we could get more self-leadership in the heads of corporations, that would trickle down in a big way in our culture. So, you know, places like that.
Great.
Yeah.
Is there anything more?
I think the last thing I want to say is that I owe a lot to my ex-wife Nancy and my 3 daughters, Jessie, Sarah, and Allie, because this sort of mission pulled me out of the family, and they suffered for it, and so I'm just really grateful for their support, even with that. So, yeah. So that's all.
Thank you so much.